Hi, I'm Valerie, and it's the beginning of February 2020, so it's time for me to give my wrap-up of what I was reading in January. So I had a little bit of a slow start to my reading challenge for the year. Work's been really busy, not that you need to know that, but I'm a little bit behind the eight ball, so I'm picking up the pace for February, but in the time being, January had 4 books that I was able to finish during the month. The first 2 books were part of the Chief Inspector Armand Gamache series, which, as I've said in previous episodes, that I've been reading sort of catch as catch can when I find one at a library sale or catch my eye. So I've been reading them out of order. I finally decided that I like them so much that I'm actually going to read them in order. Maybe reread some of the ones that I've read previously, but maybe it'd have new context if I was reading them in order. So I'm up to number 4, which is A Rule Against Murder. And these are all by Louise Penny. This one is notable because it's taking place outside of the village of Three Pines. Chief Inspector Gamache and his wife are on vacation for their anniversary, and they're at a retreat that they go to every year. And they find when they arrive that they're not alone. They in fact are staying in the middle of a sort of family reunion of a rather unpleasant family. And unsurprisingly, I guess, you do end up with some of the other characters from Three Pines showing up too, and that is Clara and Peter Morrow. Peter being the son in this family, and Clara being the sort of unwilling in-law who's drug along to them. You find out that they're pretty odd and not particularly loving in the terms of familial love or filial love in this family. But like with so many of Louise Penny's books, she kind of contrasts the warmth and the dignity and the manners of the Gamaches with some of the other characters there. And even the characters that are very unpleasant, I feel like a really enjoyable characteristic of her books is that nobody is painted with just a flat brush or really broad strokes. She really gives depth and insight into all characters, even the ones that you don't particularly come to like. So this was another enjoyable one. Goodreads gives it a 4.2, and I'd say it's a solid 4 stars for me as well. I don't want to ruin the ending, but like most of her other books, it kept me guessing right up till the end who the villain or the culprit was going to end up being. So recommend that one. The next one I read was number 5 in the same series, and it was called The Brutal Telling. And this one was really exciting because the main suspects in the murder were some of your favorite characters or people who were directly from Three Pines. So we're back in the village of Three Pines. We're learning more about kind of the usual characters that are there. Myrna, Peter, Clara again, as well as Inspector Beauvoir and Armand Gamache. So during the course of this intrigue, a murder victim ends up in the bistro that Olivier and Gabri own, is found there, and then as kind of the story unfolds, you find out that this unfortunate victim has actually been moved several times. It leads back to the fact that they're identifying this person as a hermit who lives in the woods and has sort of a treasure trove of what they're assuming are ill-gotten gains. And so, again, you're kept guessing the whole time about what the motive for the murder was, who the suspect is going to be. And again, I was just impressed by sort of Louise Penny's unflinching look at the individual characters in the book. So nobody is completely good, nobody is completely bad. she really paints and forms like fully fleshed out characters, which I really enjoy. And you end up looking at some of your favorites even in a different way throughout the course of this book. So it's left in a way that you're, obviously I know there are like 15 books, so I know there's others coming, but I can imagine if I had been reading it along, you're left kind of at the end of it. It's not a cliffhanger per se, but it ends in a surprising way, and you're eager to find out how it develops further in the next book, which I am. And I sort of had to force myself to take a break because I did have a couple other books that I needed to finish. I do a podcast series for my full-time employment. And it's on generally personal or professional development. So the next book was one that I was working on for that project. And it's called The Upside of Stress, Why Stress is Good for You and How to Get Good at It by Kelly McGonigal. And she's a PhD. And I actually saw this author speak 3-4 years ago at an ATD conference, which is the Association of Talent Development in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dr. McGonigal spoke there, and it was a really great presentation. She was one of the keynote speakers at the conference. It got me interested in her work, and I actually read the book at that time. And then, like I said, I kind of revisited it for a work project that I'm doing. And really at its heart, it talks about that stress, which is kind of a lump-all term that we use for any number of things. The way it's defined in the book is the body's reaction, our response to conditions when something important is at stake for us. And I really enjoyed this book. Dr. McGonigal is a health psychologist, so she explores kind of different topics, and she kind of said in her speech, and she has a great TED Talk as well that I'll link to, that she had spent years and years telling us what the kind of the common wisdom when it comes to stress is, and that is that, of course, it's a negative and potentially has very bad health consequences for us. So what she found out through her own studies and research is that is not really the whole story, that actually our stress response has potential to be negative, but it also has even greater potential to be a catalyst, to be a positive in our lives. That the countries with the highest GDP, the highest happiness indexes also have sort of a very high index when it comes to stress. And it goes through a lot of different studies in the book, which I would really recommend. Goodreads gives it a 4.2. It's right up there with me, if not a little higher. She talks about the potential that's there for stress to be a catalyst to drive higher performance. And it's really based around the same physiological responses that we have. And she goes into, what is actually happening physically. Our breath is quickening, so we're getting more oxygen into our body. Our liver is dumping sugar and fat into our bloodstream so that we're able to act quickly if we need to. Our heart rate is increasing to really get that oxygenated blood to our brain and throughout our body. All the chemicals that are in play, things like DHEA, oxytocin, and a host, adrenaline, all these things are like pumping through our body that are really priming us. Oxytocin being one of the ones that's really interesting, because oxytocin you may think of as like the cuddle hormone, or what's released when mothers are nursing babies. It's what's released when you're hugging someone, and it's actually there to promote support and relationships and connections. And all of these things that are happening in our body are like heightening our senses. They're turning on the learning centers in our brain. So as a result of all these things that are happening physiologically, we're actually primed with all of this energy and all of these great hormones in our body to deliver a great performance, to act more quickly, to learn better when we're actually stressed. And people with a higher stress response actually have a better recovery from things like traumatic incidents, surgeries, even to the extent that therapists are treating people with PTSD with some of these stress hormones in order to help them recover. Your heart actually has oxytocin receptors in it because oxytocin is an anti-inflammatory. It can actually help your body recover and repair from the cardiovascular strain of a stressful event. There are even doctors are treating people who are about to undergo traumatic surgeries with some of these stress hormones as well. So really interesting, fascinating stuff to me. And when you hear all the things about stress having a negative effect on the body, the key component there is the findings are that someone who has a negative outcome, shortened life or cardiovascular issues or whatever the case may be, it's not the stress itself, it's the stress combined with a negative outset, a negative anticipation or mindset towards the stress. That's the key. So in order to turn that around, we want to have a positive mindset towards stress. So getting away from that coupling of a negative mindset and the presence of stress being what's negative. Because the negative mindset can take what might be a challenge response in the body and turn it into a threat response instead, which can have negative repercussions. It can actually, constrict blood vessels. It changes kind of the ratio of hormones that are released in our bodies. So embracing stress can enable you to better use the energy of stress to meet the challenges without burning out. And it can help you turn stressful experiences into a source of social connection rather than isolation. It can lead you to find new meaning in things like suffering. And so in all these studies that Dr. McGonigal has been privy to, she has found that there are specific set of things that you need to turn around and have a positive intervention. So if you recognize that, yes, stress can be bad, but you want to flip that on its head, you want to greet it with optimism, you want to have a mindset that stress is part of a common human experience. It's not something to be avoided, and that there's potential to really find meaning in even really stressful circumstances. The three things that you want to keep in mind is you want to learn the positive viewpoint that's going to help you. You want to do an exercise that encourages you to adopt and apply the new mindset. And then finally, you want to have an opportunity to share it with someone else, because it's a great way to reinforce it. So I mentioned a few of the positive mindsets to consider, but just to reiterate, optimism, recognition of stress as part of a common human condition, also linking stress to the reason that you are stressed. If you remember the definition that we kind of talked about at the beginning of this spiel, stress is your physiological response to when something important is at stake. So think about why that thing is important to you, how you can embody your values in the way that you approach it. I do a lot of videos as part of my job. I do a lot of training as part of my job. And recently I've been doing a whole webinar series, and it has what for me a really lot of registrants. So it's had like 1,100 registrants per session. And there's potential for, flubs, public speaking being like the number one or number two most common fear, right up there with death for most people. Even though I do a lot of public speaking for my job, it's a little nerve-wracking. So I've been trying to recognize that the stress response that I've been having to these situations is actually my body prepping me to do the best possible job I can do, to be as aware, as focused, to learn as much as I can, and that it's a completely normal response to have, and it's honestly been helping me. I have this little mantra I read to myself about it, like, stress means I care about the outcome. So that's kind of the mindset that you want to learn about. Secondly is to do the exercise that encourages you to adopt and apply. So there's lots of different ways that you could approach that. The book has a ton of examples of interventions that they did with different groups. One of my favorites was an intervention that they did with freshmen in college who were feeling isolated. They had the groups read essays from juniors and seniors of college, talking about how a feeling of social isolation, anxiety were sort of normal parts of the experience, and that they were things that passed. Then they had those same students, they offered them the opportunity to write their own experience, and that as something that could be shared with incoming freshmen, so people who were going to be coming in after them who maybe would experience similar examples. And then they followed these students after they'd done this intervention and found that those that had done it had, higher academic achievement, made more friends, overall had a more positive experience. And that was just a one-time intervention. So I think doing something to tie your own experiences, to realize again that they're part of a larger human experience, not to focus on you being stressed as like proof that you're not able to handle things, but instead recognizing that it is something that everybody goes through at various points, and to trust in yourself that you do have the ability to handle the situation and to overcome it. So I that's just one example. There are tons of others. Again, doing things like tying your values to what you're doing can be really helpful. And then third, share. So I'm trying to do that. I did it as part of the podcast presentation that I did for my work, and I'm also doing it here for whatever 3 to 4 people may watch this in the future. Maybe even if it's just me, it's good reinforcement. So I know that was a lengthy bit on that, but it's a really good book and I would recommend it. The last book that I read for January was a book club selection, and it was called Then We Came to the End by Joshua Ferris. Goodreads readers gave this 3.46 on average, and it was not that high for me. I was not a fan of this book. It's set in the late 90s, early 2000s, before September 11th, initially as the book starts. It's in an advertising agency that's on the downturn. They're having a lot of layoffs. People are kind of being whittled down. It felt a little bit like a book. As an English major, I read a lot of books that were like for school, that were examples of particular styles or particular techniques that were used in writing. This one is written in the first person plural, which I guess, except for one notable section that's written in the first person of a particular character, which I would say was probably the most enjoyable section of the book for me to read. But I'm guessing the rest of the book was written that way to sort of make you feel like you were one of the office workers. I didn't get that out of it, but in thinking about it afterwards, I thought maybe, and also because of the way the book ends, it leads me to believe that that was the author's intent. For me, it felt bizarre and like I couldn't identify with any of the characters. Not like you'd really want to identify with them, because they mostly, I don't know, they all came across to me as sort of sad or craven or self-absorbed, or just not a likable bunch in in general. And I imagine that's deliberate on the off. I don't know. I don't know. I've worked in an office setting. Fortunately, I don't do that anymore. And I did recognize some of sort of the petty rivalries or that kind of some tit for tat behavior that can happen in any sort of closed society where people maybe don't have quite enough to absorb them all the time, and so get caught up in sort of weird office politics things. But I never felt the urge to read more about that type of trivialities. The back cover of the book, I mean, the way it was described did not come to fruition. It was described as a comedy. I didn't find it funny, and I just didn't care. And for what it's worth, neither did anyone else in my book group. So this one was not a winner. I did read a bunch of critical praise for it, for the book. It didn't get there with me. Anyway, so that's what I was up to in January. Thanks for reading, and I'll read more in February.